Morning finds them in city parks.
I had a gospel hour program on all Indian.
They are remote and nameless, almost like ghosts, haunting us by their presence.
10 times in the building here was my own.
1/3 to 1/2 of those sleeping on our streets today suffer from mental illness. Much is said about the homeless mentally ill, but what their plight says about us may be more significant. It seems we still haven't found a place for those who are doubly disadvantaged, both poor and insane. Once there was a place for them. Over the decades, this was a refuge for thousands of disturbed men and women. Here, at least, their basic needs were fulfilled. Now the wards lie empty and in ruin, as if hope for healing the mentally ill had also been abandoned. This is the story of St. Elizabeth's, our national mental institution for over a century. Its history raises questions that are part of an urgent debate. How and where do we care for the mentally ill? Is there once again a need for the asylum?
Whoever came up with the idea that collecting all the mad together, putting them into one building, and putting them through a particular regiment would be a curative intervention, that seems like a very odd and very strange idea. Could you at once cure and lock up? Could you at once carry out a treatment modality and at the same time hold people against their will, at the same time hold troublesome people whom the community in many ways was glad to be rid of against their will? Could one institution both, if you will, do good and do guard duty?
I often think back to the origins of the word asylum. The concept of asylum in the early 19th century was a place that a sorely troubled individual could retreat to and find somehow peace and an ability to survive. I think that in our society, the maintenance of such a means of escape from society may be absolutely indispensable for some people. And so to argue that we ought to abolish the asylum, I think is unfair to many people who cannot survive on their own and require, if not an asylum, some kind of structured setting to meet their needs.
(1841). Here in this cell of the East Cambridge Jail for Women, a wild-eyed lunatic is hiding in the gloom. Barred from the simplest human decencies, she spends her days struggling against the chain that fastens her leg to the wall. One morning, a young Sunday school teacher named Dorothea Dix catches sight of the mad woman when she visits the jail. Shocked, Dix gives up teaching and embarks on a journey to investigate the plight of the insane. In jails and poorhouses across America, she heard echoes of the conventional wisdom. The mad cannot feel heat, cold, or hunger. They are more animal than human. But Dix was convinced that the most deranged person could recover his sanity if treated with kindness and dignity. After covering more than 10,000 miles by stage, steamboat, and rail, she comes to Washington to build the case for reform. It is the mid-1800s, and women have little political clout. But Dix works tirelessly out of this boarding house, lobbying Congress to build public hospitals for the disturbed. Eventually, she counts Presidents Fillmore and Lincoln as trusted allies. Her determined efforts get results. In an era when every state was building new institutions, from orphanages to penitentiaries, Dix helped to establish 32 asylums. The most important was the monumental government hospital for the insane, located in Washington, D.C., just 2 miles from the Capitol Dome. Dix herself helped choose the peaceful site.
The hospital was a place that was set apart from the community out in the country. The assumption was a 3 to 4 month stay amidst this idyllic setting, which had a farm, grounds, opportunities for amusement, religious exercises, games, would ultimately cure the patient in 3 to 4 months.
(1855). The first patient arrives at the government asylum in Washington. Name, Thomas Sesford, 36 years old. Obviously temperate and of good moral character. But there is a history of violence in his mother's family. And he is plagued by a fantasy that some young lady is in love with him. Diagnosis of record: dementia. For the first week of his stay, Sesford has the whole place to himself. Away from the pressures of big city life, his rattled spirit is supposed to heal. His room has a homey air, a far cry from a jail cell. A few simple amusements are provided to occupy and calm his mind. As head of the household, Superintendent Charles Nichols imposes the discipline believed crucial to the patient's recovery. He lives with his family in these quarters, up the hall from Sesford's room. Nichols rings the wake-up bell at dawn, and with father-like authority schedules every hour of the patient's day, right down to the evening entertainment. Dorothea Dix once said that if a person's insanity was detected soon enough and treated with this sort of moral therapy, he would recover in months as if he had a cold or flu. But the truth was that asylum founders could only guess at the causes of insanity. And Cessford? The presumed cause of his dementia was noted in the register. Like so many patients of this era, he failed to respond to moral therapy and died in custody. In the years following the Civil War, American cities boomed, and the nation's asylums strained to keep up. The government hospital had to cope with hundreds of new admissions. Soldiers, freed slaves, and immigrants stranded in a strange land, many of them unable to explain their troubles. Originally, patients were put to work for their own sake. It was occupational therapy. But the hospital grew to depend on the free labor to function and expand. And so the asylum, the haven, came to resemble a town. It was now organized more like a factory than a family. Just as in the outside world, there were bosses and workers, upper and lower classes, patients with nothing, and patients with privileges. Consider Miss Sarah Burroughs, the schizophrenic daughter of a wealthy doctor. This 10-bedroom house was built for her on the hospital grounds. A stone's throw away was the East Lodge, where more than 60 black women spent their days behind locked doors.
Isolating the asylum from the community meant that whatever went on inside the asylum was going to be hidden. There would be no way of knowing what was happening, except for the attendants, except for those who were there. The asylum became a world apart.
By the 1870s, scandalous reports of asylum life began to reach the public. Elizabeth Packard, committed to the Illinois hospital by her husband, wrote a best-selling account of her ordeal. Readers were shocked to learn of beatings, chokings, forced ice water baths, and other abuses committed at the hands of the staff.
To work in a mental hospital was a very difficult job. The hours were extraordinarily long. There were no such things as vacations. The pay was low. And attendants were dealing with patients who sometimes behaved in bizarre and frightening ways. You had patients who smeared feces on the wall, who urinated on the floors, who refused to wear clothes, who behaved in threatening, violent manners. And consequently, you often found the staff, the attendants who spent 60 hours a week with these patients responding in kind.
The government hospital's second superintendent, W.W. Godding, had to steel himself against a public growing suspicious of the hospital's methods. He turned to a group composed of the Washington elite, the Board of Visitors. Their job was to act as the eyes and ears of the public and watch out for abuses. One evening, the superintendent and the board meet here to discuss the case of Frederick Hamburg, an asylum patient killed by a blow to the head. Newspapers say that Hamburg was struck by an attendant, but the attendant claims the hapless patient slipped and banged his head on the bathtub. The board votes to fire the employee, but the damage is already done. The asylum's reputation is sinking.
In the history of institutions, the first generation often does quite well. But the second generation, who take over the institution, end up distorting it. What happened, courtesy of an ideology that said discipline, good order, habits of training, what that soon translated itself into was an extraordinary rigidity that placed order and discipline above all else. Indeed, order and discipline without a humane touch.
"20 years after the asylum first opened its doors, one superintendent gloomily remarked, 'We are coming to the idea that very few people get well.'"
Many patients who were admitted to hospitals in the late 19th century were suffering from organic diseases for which there were no known therapies. Some of them had Huntington's disease, some of them had Alzheimer's disease, some of them had brain tumors, some were in the third stage of syphilis, which ultimately led to total paralysis and total loss of their mind. And for these people, the best that you could do was provide humane care simply because there were no therapies available.
From this gathering of asylum superintendents, they appear rather settled into their stolid Victorian ways. Little did they know that their comfortable assumptions about insanity would soon be challenged and overthrown. Godding of St. Elizabeth's was part of the old guard, but he was also among the first asylum doctors to embrace the brave new science of neurology. Neurologists said that insanity was a disease of the nervous system, and that scientific study of the nerves and brain was the only way to uncover the roots of mental disorder. The debate intensified when the mentally unstable Charles Guiteau assassinated President Garfield in July of 1881. The stage is set for a bizarre trial. At the heart of it is Guiteau's hotly contested defense, insanity. Asylum superintendents testify that Guiteau is accountable for his crime and should be punished. But neurologists argue that he has brain disease and is not responsible for his actions. The trial plays for 7 weeks to a packed courtroom. Ladies bring picnic lunches so they don't have to give up their seats. The chief spectacle at this spectacular event is the 41-year-old defendant. A part-time publisher and an advocate of free sex, Guiteau is a self-styled lawyer, and so he defends himself. To the assembled experts, Guiteau calmly explains that God asked him to remove the president, and in a highly ironic speech, he adds, "The Lord always gets the best brain he can find to do his work." Is he a devious criminal or a dangerous lunatic? The jury has little trouble deciding. After barely an hour of deliberation, they find Guiteau mentally competent and guilty as charged. On the morning of June 30th, 1882, a crowd gathers at the D.C. jail. From the gallows, Guiteau reads one of his own poems and is hanged. Later, doctors remove his brain for microscopic analysis. Their conclusion? It appeared damaged, probably because of syphilis. Most likely, then, he was insane. Superintendent Godding was stunned by the autopsy results. From then on, he dedicated himself to neurology, opening one of the first laboratories on the grounds of an institution. Using the most advanced tools available, scientists probe the brains of deceased patients. What clues are hidden in the fissures and convolutions? The microscope opens up whole new vistas for neurologists to explore. But their methods are crude. The science is still in its infancy. And, unfortunately, their research does little to illuminate the causes of insanity, no matter how carefully they record their findings. Yet they continue to collect brain specimens, hoping that some future generation might glimpse, in a tangle of nerves, the reason for madness itself. While researchers performed autopsies in the hospital labs, the wards nearby were filling up with thousands of patients. With no breakthrough in sight, all they could do was wait. Then, as the 20th century began, Sigmund Freud blazed a new path in the treatment of mental disturbances. By emphasizing how early childhood experiences shaped the self, Freud challenged the belief that insanity was strictly a biological disease. Attention turned to the unconscious mind. In 1929, the world's leading psychoanalysts gathered in England for an international conference and a celebration of the new science of the mind. Many of these men and women now saw their future in lucrative, challenging, private practices. And so they left institutions to set up shop on their own. But a few exceptional talents remained. In fact, the government hospital's new superintendent, William A. White, was one of the first to try psychoanalysis on hospitalized patients.
Of course.
My mother never
As White saw it, the task was to consider the emotional history of each patient. So he probed, analyzed, and charted every facet of the individual's personality. White eventually had to admit that for severely disturbed patients, results were disappointing. Nonetheless, he put the brightest face possible on asylum life, publicizing events like this 1920s May Day celebration. To play down the image of a madhouse, White had the word insane dropped from the institution's title. It became known as St. Elizabeth's, after the patron saint of healing. Under White's command, the hospital doubled in size. But to keep it all running smoothly, that was the challenge. The consummate organization man, White draws up grandiose personnel charts accounting for every staff member, from the barber to the psychiatrist, marshaling his troops in the battle against insanity. Overloaded with minute details, his plan grows more and more elaborate. Everything looks calm and ordered, but it is becoming clear that there are too many staff members and too many patients to control, even from White's perspective.
As the numbers grow, the state hospital is left with the extraordinary assignment of housing and caring for thousands of patients. Sometimes the buildings would expand to keep up. St. Elizabeth's may have been one of the lucky ones in the sense of expansion of construction, keeping up with numbers. Other hospitals were not so lucky. And so bed would follow upon bed, crammed into the most extraordinary narrow spaces, day rooms filled with people. And this is the assignment given to the state hospital. You handle the failures. You handle those who we could not cure.
Partly out of desperation, partly out of faith in scientific trial and error, asylum doctors began experimenting on patients, searching for a therapy that worked. They tried water, heat, electricity, radiation, convulsions, insulin shock. And here, a patient considered too aggressive was given the ultimate treatment, lobotomy.
They search desperately, but without very much effect. They search for some kind of wholesale cure, some kind of administration of a drug, a potion, a technique that would enable them to deliver a quick cure. They don't have the staff or the resources to do it intimately one-to-one to thousands of back-ward difficult patients. At one time, it may be shock therapy. At a later time, it'll be lobotomy. Again and again, the effort to try to find that quick fix which will help resolve the problem.
Frustrated by their failure to help the chronic mentally ill, doctors focused on a group of patients who could be cured. As wounded soldiers came home from World War II, it was noted with alarm that 1 out of 5 suffered from shell shock, a psychiatric disorder.
Every man has his breaking point, and these, in the fulfillment of their duties as soldiers, were forced beyond the limit of human endurance. Here are men who tremble, men who cannot sleep, men with pains that are nonetheless real because they are of mental origin, men who cannot remember, paralyzed men whose paralysis is dictated by the mind.
Plunged into a brutal environment, thousands of otherwise healthy men broke down. To post-war Americans, the message was clear. A major cause of mental illness is stress.
My nerves have always been delicate. I remember one time my mother scolded me for not picking up my toys when I was 2 or 3 years old.
Psychiatrists carried this lesson over into the post-war era. That is, if stress is the basic cause of mental illness in some form or another, then the logical place to treat patients was not in the hospital, but in the community before they had proceeded so far down the line that they required hospitalization. The assumption was that early treatment in community clinics, largely through psychotherapy, could prevent most psychiatric symptoms. So that beginning in the late 40s, there was a tremendous effort to found community treatment facilities. The difficulty was that no one then asked the question, what would happen to the hospitalized patients?
This is my hospital. Looks very pretty from the outside, doesn't it? Plenty of room for the birds and the squirrels. I have been a patient here in this building for 2 years. I want you to come inside and see what I see every day. There are 118 patients in this one ward alone. A ward intended for only 60. Some are more disturbed than others, and we're all in each other's ways. There are patients here that have been living in this ward for over 20 years. It's crowded and smelly, but some don't remember any other home.
Before nursing homes, many of the senile are crowded into asylums where grim efficiency rules. Here, attendants herd woman after woman through. Some come in wheelchairs, others on stretchers. Patients are stripped naked, held under the steamy water, soaked and rubbed. For thousands of elderly inmates, the private rituals of daily life are reduced to a degrading spectacle. Finally, medical science heralded radical change. Pills, pills, a pill for every ill. In the 50s, when better living through chemistry was the telltale slogan, it made sense that drugs would rescue the insane. Lithium for manic depression, Thorazine for schizophrenia.
This is me when I came to the hospital. I was very upset from many worries. They make me sick. I could not even talk to the doctor. No, I don't want it. You can have it. She's too big for me. Hold it now. Vete, papi. Vete, Dios.
Miraculous before and after demonstrations suggested that the magic bullet was at hand.
Estúpido. Dear Lord, have mercy. I am better now. This is me when I'm ready to leave the hospital. I said goodbye to my doctor. I am very happy to go home.
Sally is going home today. Result of treatment with new drugs in psychiatry. Drugs that were not even available as much as 2 years ago. These new medicines have effected a tremendous change in all of psychiatric treatment. As a result of their use, patients who were hitherto unmanageable or untreatable, or who had resisted all other forms of treatment, now have been helped.
Here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where our patients are numbered literally in the thousands, with the advent of these new tranquilizing drugs, it seems not too much to say that we're on the verge of an entirely new era in the treatment of mental illness.
The problem was that the public and the media picked up on these drugs as a kind of cure-all. The psychiatric drugs in the 1950s were equated with the introduction of antibiotic drugs such as penicillin in the 1940s, which basically enabled us to deal very easily with infectious diseases, and they were very unrealistic understanding of the uses to which these drugs could be pushed. The presumption of many people was that once you had these drugs, we would be able to simply close up the hospitals and send home all the patients.
I know and well appreciate the fact that drugs had come, but those in and of themselves might not necessarily have led anywhere in terms of moving away from the institutions. For that, I think you have to understand the impact of civil libertarian-minded lawyers, people who thought about institutions essentially as places where liberty was deprived. They could understand the idea that if one took away one's liberty, one delivered something in return for that, let's say treatment. But as they looked at mental hospitals, they saw quite clearly that there was no quid pro quo. You took away people's liberty and you delivered nothing. You delivered a day room. You delivered one psychiatrist for 1,500 or indeed 15,000 people. So why deprive someone of liberty?
While activists of the 60s took to the streets, legal battles to free mental patients were fought in the nation's courts. In 1963, President Kennedy proposed legislation that would finally unlock asylum doors.
The time has come for a great national effort. Nearly half of the 530,000 persons in our state mental hospitals are in institutions with over 3,000 patients, getting little or no individual treatment. Many of these institutions have less than half of the professional staff required. 45% of them have been hospitalized for 10 years or more. If we launch a broad new health program now, it will be possible within a decade to reduce the number of patients now under custodial care by up to 50%.
With the stroke of a pen, Kennedy launched the policy known as deinstitutionalization. As a result, the government would back clinics and halfway houses in the community where care was more humane and cost less. And so the forces of reform, which gave birth to the asylum, started working in reverse. Over the next 2 decades, more than 75% of St. Elizabeth's patients were released. In the eyes of a generation steeped in civil rights, liberty was finally restored to thousands who were locked away, having done no wrong. To be sure, deinstitutionalization has worked for many. Helen Bowser left St. Elizabeth's in 1978 and moved into a halfway house in downtown Washington.
We can move over a little bit, like we always do. Did I give you enough money, John?
Today, she lives there with other former patients and holds down a job in the community. With counseling, prescription drugs, and financial aid, Helen has made a new life for herself. But even after all this time, memories of St. Elizabeth's still haunt her.
I had a dream that I was in a jail, that these bars were all around me, and I tried to get out and I couldn't get out, and it reminded me so much of a hospital. All of a sudden I was going in an ambulance, and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what was happening to me. Why I was in an ambulance, I didn't know why. I kept saying, well, I don't have a stomach ache, because I didn't understand mental illness, and I thought I kept saying I didn't have a stomach ache, and I don't understand why I'm here.
Barbie, I have no idea how long they will keep her. That's
Everything had been taken away from me. I had no rights, no nothing. Just like that, overnight, everything was taken away from me. I was hospitalized in 1957, 30 years ago, when I was 14, and I spent 16 years off and on at St. Elizabeth. And I hated that place. I hated it, every minute there, every second. I don't think I had to go through all that to get well. I was asking for help, and they were giving me hell instead of help. We'd get up in the morning with bright lights in our faces at 6 o'clock. Then we would have medicine. People that didn't have privileges like me, for instance, would sit in the day room all day long. Our bedroom doors were locked until 7 or so at night. We'd sleep on the floors, we'd be so doped up with medicine. It's very demoralizing being locked up because they take away your rights as a human being and your freedom as a human being, the rights to walk on grass, to walk on where trees are. They take that away from you. It's like being in jail, except worse, I think. You lose your self-respect in a hospital. You have to have self-respect. If you don't have self-respect, you're a goner. You might as well just commit yourself there for life. I was frightened when I moved out of the hospital because I've been locked away for so many years. I didn't know how to act in the community. I didn't know how to respond or what to do or anything. See, I didn't know how to handle myself. I almost became one of the homeless.
The grim reality is that many patients released from mental hospitals now make their homes on park benches and subway grates. These are the human casualties of a policy founded on the best intentions. We must ask ourselves, what went wrong?
Deinstitutionalization was flawed in certain fundamental respects. It assumed that there was a community that was willing, able, ready, and prepared to receive mentally ill people and provide them with a complete range of supportive services. This simply was not the case. Most communities were unwilling to receive these patients, and consequently, we ended up with a significant number of former mental patients either living in welfare hotels or out on the streets, living in conditions that were much worse than those that they had experienced in hospitals.
How do I feel, having played some role in trying to move these people out of asylums into the streets? And obviously, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that, in fact, we couldn't deliver a better and more humane policy to them. But unlike others, I think I also know that a good deal of the misery that we see here, they also would have experienced in the asylum, except we wouldn't have seen it. That they would have been trapped in a place that really wasn't all that different from what Dorothea Dix saw in the 1840s, but would have had the advantage, and I would use advantage in quotes, of shielding their misery from me. So as I look at their plight, and I understand what they're going through, I still have the overriding sense that if they're back in that asylum, their plight is invisible and nothing will ever happen of any value to them.
In the wake of deinstitutionalization, St. Elizabeth's has gone through drastic changes. For one thing, most patients now come to the hospital for day treatment or brief stays. With 1,400 beds, the institution is not even 1/5 its former size. As a result, the burden of long-term care falls mostly on families and area shelters. In addition, the reform movement has strengthened the rights of patients who now have more say in their own treatment.
Okay, the majority has it.
We still do not have a doctor on guarding noise. See, the chief doctor of the hospital is going into private business, so nobody has appointed a new doctor for our ward.
Our office will get that.
We don't have phone for the patient, and the only phone we can talk, that the phone belongs to the staff, and you don't have no privacy when you talk. The staff hear everything you say, and sometimes make it funny, and you.
Our advocate office can check into that. You have the right for your own privacy. Oh, that's Ms. Hazelton.
Last month we had 148 complaints. 99% of these complaints were resolved satisfactorily.
99%.
For a dwindling number of the mentally ill, St. Elizabeth's is still an asylum in the old sense of the word. Betty Kennemer spent nearly 2 years there. The hospital, she says, literally saved her life.
It's important to have a haven, to have a place to regroup, to gather strength again, to work on dealing with something that's very difficult, and that's mental illness. I came in not knowing what to expect. I had never heard of the place, honestly. When I got here the first night, I was unsure still.
You have a right to get mail, receive mail, make telephone calls, get telephone calls. You have a right to have visitors, your family, your friends, the chaplain, pastor, your lawyer. You have a right to talk to the doctors and the nurses about what's happening to you, your medications, your treatment plan.
When I came to St. Elizabeth's, I was homeless and freezing and starving on the streets, out there lost and helpless. And they put a roof over my head and food in my mouth and clothes on my back for 22 months free My family during the majority of this time had backed away because the pain of seeing me go through it was too much for them. I had no contact with them. I was allowed no contact with them by their own choice. Here at the hospital, it was helpful to know that I wasn't the only one, to have someone to struggle with me.
Would you ever forgive yourself for trying to commit suicide?
Yes, I will. But it takes one step at a time, right? Every day she's getting a little better.
There were people that had been taxi cab drivers, and there were attorneys here. There were people from every walk of life, and they all had the same problems that I did. And, well, there's no cure, but we're learning to deal with it for the rest of our lives.
And what kind of problems are you having with them?
One of the things that really prepared me to leave the hospital was industrial therapy. Volunteer services, may I help you? I was given a chance to work at a non-competitive job here on the grounds. I've been an outpatient for 2 years. Looking back, I realized that it was a chance for me to learn to deal with my mental illness and also to have a chance on the outside to strengthen myself so that I could make it again out in the city. I look back and I see that it was a time that I needed very much.
For some people, community support systems, halfway houses, and other kinds of services may suffice to meet their needs. And we can do far better at that than we have done up to now. But there are other people who, no matter what you do for them in the community, may very well require a totally structured environment. Call it an institution, call it a hospital, call it an asylum, the name does not matter. What matters is that you provide them with the security of a place that isolates them from a world that they cannot deal with.
Look, as convenient as it may be to put people away, as comfortable as it is for a middle-class community to be rid of homeless people, as comfortable as it is for them to be rid of those who are labeled mentally ill, isn't it time we tried something else? And not half-heartedly, and not with some kind of sense that, here's an experiment. Enough. It's not an experiment. In some ways, I think it's our only alternative at this point. We have 150 years of failure with asylums. It's time that we invested completely, thoroughly, and diligently in alternatives.
In October 1987, after 130 years, the federal government gave up as caretaker of St. Elizabeth's. The 320-acre hospital is now run by the local D.C. government. And like most asylums in America, it has an uncertain future. Plans for the historic buildings and grounds range from a halfway house complex to a high-priced condominium city. Whatever happens, it seems we have come full circle since the days of Dorothea Dix. Where she saw mentally ill paupers locked in jails, we find them trapped on the streets. Today, the struggle remains what it was for Dix: to treat the afflicted in a way that does more good than harm, and to offer the needy, at the very least, shelter. No one wants to go back to the asylums of old, but it should be possible to salvage what was good about the place. It was warmer than a jail, safer to sleep in than an alley. It stood for our desire to heal the disturbed. Now, much of it lies in ruins. And yet we have not really created, or built, or even dreamed of anything to take the place of the asylum.